Okay, 5:30. Should we start?
Absolutely.
All right, here we go.
Robin, can you let us know when everyone is here that you can see? I can just see us.
Yeah, so right now we have about 13 people who have joined us.
Great. Welcome, everyone. I'll just wait for a couple minutes to see who else joins. Welcome, everyone who signed in. We're still just waiting on some folks to join. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Okay, I think we can get going. Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we're here to discuss the land use bylaw. And before we get going with a presentation, I thought the team here could just introduce ourselves briefly. My name is Eleanor Mohammed, and I am a partner at Dialogue, the consultant who's working with the city on the renewal of the land use bylaw. And I'm the partner in charge for this project. Josh, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Eleanor. Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Reiniger. I'm a senior planner in urban design with Dialogue. Robin, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Robin Stebner, and I'm also an urban planner at Dialogue. Pass it on to Chelsea.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Whitty. I am an urban planner and an associate at Dialogue, and I'll pass it over to Lindsay.
Hey everyone, I'm Lindsay Francis, and I'm an independent planning consultant working with Dialogue to make the land use bylaw. And I'll hand it over to Jessica.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Jessica Loy, Senior Planner. I'm with the City of Leduc and the project manager on this land use bylaw renewal project. And April?
Yeah, and that leaves me. I'm April Renneberg. I'm an urban planner, manager planning projects with the City of Leduc as well.
Perfect. Thank you. And welcome, everyone. Okay, lovely. I'm just waiting for the PowerPoint to come up. Wonderful. So if we could just do the next slide, please. So I want to start tonight with an acknowledgement that Leduc is situated within Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and modern day territories of the Nahiawak, Denisuli, Niitsitapi, Anishinaabe, and Nakota Iska peoples. While we are meeting virtually, it is important to recognize the lands in Leduc, where they are, and the lands we all call home. As planners, urban designers, and professionals in city building industry, We recognize the importance of improving our own understanding of local cultures and land rights to move forward towards reconciliation. Just an overview of our presentation tonight. We're going to start off with the vision and objectives and what we've heard through this process, and the updated approach to the land use bylaw, key changes and updates being made, an overview of the land use districts and the land use districts area, and then also the land use districts. And then we'll follow up with a question and answer session and discussion at the end. So the purpose of the presentation is to provide an overview of the draft land use bylaw, including all the major changes from the current land use bylaw, and then also to gather some feedback to inform the review and to create make some refinements to the draft land use bylaw. And today we're just going to set out a meeting code of conduct. So as participants today, we are all agreeing to treat everyone with kindness and respect, value the diversity of opinions that everyone participating has, focusing on critiquing ideas rather than individuals, refraining from disruptive or disrespectful conduct and language, and respecting the process for participation. So most importantly, answering the question of how you can participate. So as the presentation goes on, we'll be popping up some poll questions and they'll come up on your screen and you'll be able to respond to them. There's also the opportunity to submit questions through the question and answer box. And if we find that we're getting very similar questions, what we'll do is we'll kind of group those together just to be more efficient and use everyone's time the best that we can. And then when we get to the end with the question and answer and discussion portion, we just need you to click the raise your hand button and let the moderator know you have a question or a comment, in which case we will unmute you and you'll have the opportunity to speak. So the raise hand button is, hopefully you have the same version I do here, is just at the bottom of the screen in the center. So if you just click that button, it will show you that your hand is raised, and then we'll just take the questions in the order that we receive them. Perfect. And with that, I will hand it off to Robin.
All right, thank you, Eleanor. So I will be speaking to the overall vision of the renewed land use bylaw, as well as objectives that we're working towards through this project and what we've heard so far from the community and the industry. And these all together will form the foundation of how this project will shape not only the regulations, but also the outcomes of this renewed bylaw. So here on the screen, you'll see a project timeline. This project is a multi-phase project that began last year and is going to continue on until the anticipated end of this year. So to date, we have completed the first 3 phases of the project. Phase 1 focused on background research and analysis, while Phase 2 focused on engagement with both the community as well as the development industry to gain an understanding of what was important to Leduc. And then in Phase 3, we took those findings from Phase 1 and 2 to establish our first draft of the land use bylaw, which takes us now to Phase 4, where we're currently sharing this first iteration of the land use bylaw with both the public, the city, and the development community to share and kind of gain feedback on where that's landing. And then finally, in Phase 5, we're going to refine the land use bylaw based on what we hear, and then work towards a final land use bylaw to be approved and implemented in Phase 6. The vision for the renewed land use bylaw is simple but important. We want the bylaw to be user-friendly, resident-focused, and easier to navigate, whether you're a homeowner, a builder, or a business owner. And at the same time, we want the bylaw to support community well-being and streamline development so that projects are easier to deliver and expectations are clearer from the start. To support this vision, the project is guided by 7 different objectives. So this includes encouraging a diverse range of housing options to support people at different stages of life, and then as well as allowing amenities to be located close to where you're living. Stewarding land responsibly for future generations, as well as improving Leduc's economic competitiveness. We're also striving to better integrate land use with mobility options such as walking, cycling, and transit. And then we also want to ensure that we're utilizing existing and planned infrastructure to the best of our ability. And then building also on Leduc's local history, culture, and character. And last of all, supporting agricultural and local food production of lands prior to urban development. So through engagement to date with residents, we have heard several consistent themes, and these 5 highlight the top themes that we did hear from our earlier engagement. So first of all, there's a clear support for more housing options within neighborhoods, while maintaining, though, at the same time, that neighborhood character and livability, particularly in established neighborhoods. We also heard that parking is very important. So wanting to ensure that people see that balance between new housing as well as available parking on the street, and that parking is also being accommodated on site. We also heard quite significantly about the open spaces in Leduc and the importance of those to residents, including protecting Telford Lake, preserving mature trees, and parks throughout the city. There was also support for walkable communities, including an integrated multi-way and trail system, along with a desire for better transit connections, both locally and regionally to the surrounding communities and to Edmonton. And finally, people value having shops and amenities close to where they're living, and emphasizing that walkable community theme that we did here. From the development and industry perspective, we heard slightly different set of priorities. First of all, we heard that there was strong support for a more simple and flexible land use bylaw with fewer districts and clearer rules that can adapt and respond to changing housing market conditions. Parking was also emphasized with support for reducing parking reductions to provide more design flexibility and improve affordability. Industry participants also identified barriers to development, such as building design rules, density limits, lot widths, and parking regulations. We also heard that there was feedback on wanting to improve site design regulations to better align setback, corner cut, and laneway standards when recognizing corner conditions. And lastly, there was feedback provided on reassessing the amenity and landscaping requirements in the land use bylaw to reduce burden as well as to support affordability. In response to what we heard and to align with best practices, the renewed land use bylaw proposes an updated regulatory approach. So first of all, this includes simplifying and consolidating regulations by moving more towards a hybrid form-based code. So for those who are not familiar with what that means, Lindsay will be speaking to that here shortly to take us through what that means exactly. But overall, this means that the focus is going to be more so on the type of buildings, the size and the shape, and how that promotes neighborhood character overall. So this update will also take zoning more at a neighborhood scale versus by a lot basis in order to help simplify those rules, create more consistent outcomes, and support that overall look and character of an area. This update's also going to allow for a greater mix of uses across the city while still managing that compatibility of uses. And most importantly, the update will establish a clearer relationship between context and buildings. So what this might mean, for example, is where streets are wider and transit is available, buildings might be larger and to accommodate more people. And then lastly, before I hand the presentation over to Lindsay, I'm just going to provide a bit of context on how the land use bylaw renewal project is connecting to initiatives being undertaken by the city. So to support future housing opportunities in Leduc, The city is completing 7 initiatives under the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is a federal program designed to help local governments build homes faster. So the land use bylaw renewal project itself will achieve 3 of these initiatives by updating regulations to be more flexible and support more housing types, by eliminating exclusionary zoning. It will also review changes to allow up to 4 units in residential and mixed use districts where it makes sense or if it makes sense, and then also where other regulations like building separation, parking, landscaping, setbacks are being met. And then lastly, it will look at creating a housing catalog with pre-approved housing designs to speed up building permit approvals. And then with that, I will pass it on to Lindsay.
Thanks, Robin. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what is a hybrid form-based code and what does it mean. So a hybrid form-based code is a type of zoning that focuses both on what buildings look like, so their size, their shape, how they're placed on a lot, and how they're used. So used for things like housing, for shops, or offices. Instead of separating uses as strictly as traditional zoning, it prioritizes creating a consistent, walkable, and attractive streetscape while still allowing a mix of compatible uses. So how does it work? It sets some clear rules for building form. So for things like the height, the setbacks, the frontage, and the design. It allows a mix of uses within the same area where appropriate. And it uses maps, diagrams, and written standards to guide development outcomes and create a more user-friendly bylaw. So we're using this approach because it creates more predictable and legible regulations for developers and homeowners. It encourages vibrant neighborhoods and focuses on community character. And it creates clear expectations but allows flexibility to achieve them. So this type of regulation focuses on the scale of the building envelope, and that's determined by regulations like setbacks, how far back does the building have to be from property lines, height, how tall can a building be, transition and separation distance, how close can it be to other buildings, and it puts less of a focus on regulating density and lot coverage, instead focusing on that scale and character of buildings. So looking at some conceptual illustrations here about how this regulation approach applies to the city. First, it identifies some broad land use zones as zones such as residential, commercial, industrial, shown in different colors here. Then it identifies the street hierarchy. So our local streets, our collector roads, and arterial roads. And then within each district, it creates subcategories that respond to that street typology and context. So those major, wider streets that accommodate that more traffic and transit can accommodate more people and larger buildings. And that leads us to our very first poll question. So I'll read it out loud and you should get a pop-up on your screen to respond. The renewed land use bylaw links the size of the building to the size of the street and the context. Since larger streets are wider, they can accommodate larger buildings. For example, houses, duplex, and townhomes are generally allowed on smaller local roads, while apartments and mixed-use buildings are generally allowed on major roads. Do you agree with this approach to the renewed land use bylaw? So we'll just give everyone a couple seconds here to respond. Okay, thanks everyone. Next, we'll move on to our next section. So we're going to go over next highlighting the major changes to the draft land use bylaw. So the first major change and update is about the land uses. So the uses in a land use bylaw are the specific activities or purposes that are allowed or restricted on a property. So things like houses, shops, or offices. In the current land use bylaw, there's 112 different land uses. And we have tried to consolidate this down to 56 uses by consolidating similar uses that have similar development impacts. So, for example, the definition of different types of housing it is single detached, duplex, townhousing, and that's been reduced to one dwelling unit. So instead of permitting types of buildings, the new land use bylaw would permit a number of dwelling units, creating flexibility for landowners in how they build. The next major update is to the overlays. So the current, an overlay, sorry, pop-up keeps coming up. An overlay in the land use bylaw is an extra layer of rules that are applied to certain areas of the standard zoning. So that could be like adding specific requirements or protections for things like heritage or natural features, or adding specific design regulations. And the current land use bylaw has 10 overlays, and we've reduced this down to 2. And what we've done here is we've incorporated the previous overlays into the district regulations to simplify reading the bylaw. So the remaining 2 overlays involve provincial regulations and guidelines, and they include the airport vicinity protection overlay and the Queen Elizabeth II highway corridor guidelines. And our major changes to the districts. So when we talk about a land use district, that's the area of a land use bylaw that are the mapped areas of a city where a common set of rules apply, like what can be built and how it can be used. So to simplify the land use bylaw, we've consolidated from 18 core districts to 13. And now we've got 3 main residential districts. We've expanded the mixed use permission in some areas that are currently just used for commercial buildings. And residential districts now enable some degree of mixed use development, including that neighborhood scale commercial on certain streets. Okay, so we've got our second poll question here. The renewed land use bylaw still focuses on keeping incompatible land uses apart. However, it allows for some mixing of uses. So things like businesses, like coffee shops and doctor's offices, can be within our neighborhoods. Do you agree with this approach to the renewed land use bylaw? And again, we'll just wait a couple seconds and give people a chance to respond. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Josh for the next section.
Thanks, Lindsay. So what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about those 13 districts that Lindsay mentioned, and actually where they are in Leduc, and talk about, Leduc as a whole, kind of zooming way out before we start to talk about what's going on in individual lots, and talk about the actual, what I would call the kind of structure of the city. So the 13 districts that emerged out of this process so far in our draft land use bylaw are 4 residential districts, 3 kind of commercial and mixed use districts, some 3 industrial districts, urban services and natural heritage, which deal more with kind of open spaces and community amenities, and then urban transition, which is land that's within the municipal boundary and designated for development in the future, but is currently undeveloped land. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of walk through the entire city of Leduc and start to show you where these zones are placed and where these districts are located, to give a bit of context for where some of these ideas are coming from. So when we start to think about Leduc, one of the main kind of defining features of the city is the highway and the railway, which divide and provide access to Leduc. So there's some really important intersections that come out of this. There's some important setback considerations and relationships between kind of these heavier infrastructure pieces and land uses that would be adjacent to them. Next, we go into the urban center. So the city of Leduc already has something called the Urban Center Redevelopment Plan, which is kind of a revitalization and development plan specifically for the urban center or the downtown of Leduc. And so that's where we're going to start thinking about Leduc here. At 50th and 50th, that's kind of the crossroads of the city in a lot of ways. And there's kind of these two big corridors, and that's how we're thinking about them, as these corridors. The historic Main Street area there, that little kind of pink arrow to the right, that's the smallest land use district that we've got in all of the land use bylaw, the draft bylaw. And that's because it has such special considerations, really from form-based considerations. You know, we want to maintain the character of the historic Main Street. So there's some really specific things about it that make it unique. And then the kind of bigger red arrows, that's more of a mixed-use corridor through the city. And that's where we'll see some of the larger buildings that are allowed in the land use bylaw, but a lot of thought going into kind of the form. We talked about this being kind of a hybrid form-based code, so a lot of thought going into the form of these things so that there's compatible kind of adjacencies between existing low-rise uses and the historic Main Street and newer mixed-use development that may come in the future in this area. Those mixed use areas kind of wrap the urban center, and within it there's this orange stuff, which is urban residential. And so that's more probably the highest density kind of residential district that we're looking at. The rest of it's going to be more in the neighborhood context. So what this shows you is a kind of a newer definition of what we're thinking about the urban center as, which is slightly expanded to the north to capture some areas that are currently kind of strip mall plazas that are being enabled to have more mixed use development in the future. The next kind of layer out is what we're calling residential established areas. So these are the oldest neighborhoods in Leduc, some of the larger lots in the city. So they've got some really unique characteristics and some special things to consider as we're thinking about regulating these areas. One of the kind of interesting things, we were talking earlier about how there's a relationship between street types and land use and street types and building form. So we've got this idea of a kind of minor, and you can see it in kind of green. If I flip back and forth between these two a little bit, you can see how these collector roads have this extra kind of green lots around them. And what that's indicating is that on those collector roads, there would be slightly increased permissions for different things, and potentially a slightly increase in the number of units that might be permitted on a lot. Those are kind of details we're still working through. But the idea is that we would reinforce these kind of community-sized corridors through it, not like we are the main arterial roads, but kind of at a neighborhood scale. The next one out is the residential general. So that's a lot of the newer communities that are in Leduc, and these are really defined by a great diversity of lot sizes. You'll find kind of narrower lot buildings, you'll find wider lot buildings, lots of different building types. So it's a fairly diverse kind of set of conditions. So it requires a different type of regulation than the more established neighborhoods do. Similarly, you can see that some of those collector roads are plugged into the ones in the residential established communities, and so they're connected. And the same idea, there's kind of a slight increase in what might be possible on those roads because they are collector roads, because they have the greater potential for transit in the future. So there's kind of a distinction that we're putting on those particular lots. And then there's residential manufactured. So there's two existing kind of manufactured home communities that are being kind of proposed. They're staying in the same place and no new ones are proposed at this time. When you come out of the urban center, there are these kind of arterial roads that connect the residential neighborhoods to each other. So these carry a lot of traffic. They carry transit vehicles. So these are really important kind of connections all the way through, really important urban infrastructure. what's interesting is we have this kind of we had talked about the relationship between streets and land use. So along the arterial roads, which is where the greatest permissions may be allowed, we're calling the major, quote unquote major. But you'll see because of the amount of rear lotting, and rear lotting means that, along a lot of these arterial roads, it's backyards that face the street rather than the front of the house. So because a lot of these arterials are facing backyards rather than houses, there's not actually a lot of land that falls into that category. It's just these kind of black parcels you see here along 46 running north-south and then along 50th going east-west. So it's kind of a small amount of area we talk about when we say major in residential districts, but important consideration, and as the city evolves, it may become more useful in kind of newer planned communities. There are then a series of commercial areas that are all connected by these arterial roads. And these are kind of important areas that we're thinking of could in time evolve to be more mixed use. And they would allow them to become more of a kind of neighborhood center that's local hubs with shops and services and employment and residential buildings kind of mixed together. And that may be kind of something that happens over the course of a generation, but it would enable those shopping plazas to change and evolve over time if the market requires and if there's demand and if that's something that the community is interested in. Next is Leduc Commons, and that's remaining kind of a general commercial designation, which kind of keeps it kind of in the same use that it has now. And that's because it's basically a regionally significant commercial destination. So it's kind of maintaining its same purpose. Then when we kind of shift and start to look to the north side of the city, our big mixed-use corridor starts to evolve into more of a commercial and industrial corridor going all the way north towards Airport Road. So north of 59th Ave, the relationship between land use starts to change, and it starts to become more of a general commercial and light industrial area. So these light industrial uses line these corridors and are the closest to the urban center, and that's kind of an existing land use relationship that's there today that we're trying to kind of keep pushing forward, because that basically creates a really good buffer zone between the urban center and some of the kind of medium industrial uses that exist farther north in the center there. So the medium industrial in that darker purple gets to be fully bound by kind of lighter industrial uses and commercial uses. So it creates a nice kind of buffering condition, and there's kind of layers of land use. So the industrial intensity kind of dissipates the closer you get to where people live. And then there's these special industrial uses, and special industrial uses are a little bit of the heavier kind of industrial uses, are located in those kind of 5, 6 darker purple parcels there along the railway. Something that's kind of unique about this, it's a bit of a detail, is that gray area is creating a buffer around those special industrial uses. And what it does is it removes some land uses that encourage public congregation, and that's for public safety reasons, so that if something happens on one of those special industrial sites, there's not a lot of people in the area. So it's a bit of a nuance to this district. And then next we've got urban services and natural heritage, urban services in blue, and really urban services again is kind of regionally significant civic infrastructure. So big recreation centers, golf course, hospitals, civic center, those types of places. I'll note that public parks, community parks are actually located within each residential district. So they're not showing specifically on this map, but they're kind of just enabled in every neighborhood. And then natural heritage is more of that environmental protection kind of zone. And then lastly, we've got urban transition, again, which is kind of holding an interim agricultural use for land that has been designated for future development or may already have plans for future development. So that gets us to our draft land use map. So I will pass it back to Lindsay to start talking about some of our land use districts.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh. As I mentioned earlier, we have simplified those housing uses. So in our residential districts, we've simplified them. So this would include primary houses, suites, and now it's under the use dwelling unit. And then we have also had kept manufactured homes the same. Also within our residential districts, we've created a new district called residential urban, and this is to support more residential development surrounding the urban center in line with the urban center redevelopment plan. Also to support the walkable communities and having access to daily amenities, some service commercial uses are now permitted within residential districts. And so those could be things like childcare facilities, some retail and service shops as well. And as Robin mentioned, parking is really important, and we've heard that it's really important to get right. So we are exploring if there are options for areas where there might be some minor reductions, but these would be in areas where is already sufficient street parking, perhaps in the urban center, near some fixed transit routes, and possibly for suites and apartments, but not looking at any major changes there. And also in the residential districts, instead of regulating the type of building, like if it's a townhouse or a duplex or a suite, the bylaw will regulate the maximum number of dwelling units permitted on a lot. So up to 4 dwelling units are permitted on residential and mixed use zones. So with this regulation, we're trying to make sure that it's designed in a way that it makes sense for Leduc. So the regulations have been designed to mitigate the impacts to the neighborhood through requirements for things like building size, building placement, parking, and landscaping. So even though up to 4 units are permitted, not all lots are going to have the right conditions to construct 4 units. So on the next couple of slides here, we have some diagrams to sort of show how those regulations apply to a lot. And on this slide, we've got a lot that you might find in the established neighborhood. It's a larger lot, and it's large enough to accommodate a range of housing types and designs. So it's a 15-meter wide lot. And on each lot, there's setback requirements. So how far back the building has to be from each property line. And this sort of, you can see how it reduces the area that is developable on the lot. And then within the residential established district, there's also a maximum lot coverage of 45%. So that means that buildings can't cover more than 45% of the lot within those setbacks, which further reduces that developable area. There's also a minimum soft landscaping requirement of 40%, meaning each lot must preserve 40% for soft landscaping. So soft landscaping would include lawns, mulch, gardens, and trees, but it would exclude paved areas or decked areas like driveways, porches, and walkways. So if you were to have a secondary building on that lot, it still must be accommodated within that 45% maximum lot coverage, and the lot still must maintain that 40% soft landscaping requirement. And then if we look at the parking requirements, such as having 2 parking stalls and a paved area for that, again, we could see this developable area being reduced. So if we are looking at putting a building that has 3 or 4 units in it, it's going to require an even greater degree of parking. So this means the space for the building is constrained. And this diagram represents a larger lot. So narrow lots might not be able to accommodate those 4 units due to the land and parking constraints. So while 4 units may be permitted, the regulations are designed to ensure that the size and the shape of multi-unit buildings are consistent with the size and shape permitted for single detached houses. So now we've got our next poll question, and that's the renewed land use bylaw proposes allowing up to 4 dwelling units in residential and mixed-use districts to support affordability and housing variety to meet the needs of all residents. However, not all lots will be able to accommodate 4 dwelling units due to requirements such as parking setbacks, landscaping, and access. The regulations are designed to ensure the size and shape of a multi-unit building is consistent with the size and shape permitted for a single detached house. Do you agree with this approach to the land use bylaw? And again, we'll just wait a couple of seconds for everyone to put in their answers. All right, thank you, everyone. So next we'll go through the specific districts. First is the residential established. So the purpose of this district is to provide low-density residential development in established neighborhoods. So the uses that you would see there would be residential dwelling units, and some neighborhood commercial would slowly be introduced along some major roads. So this is equivalent to the residential standard district in the current land use bylaw. And within this district, there's an emphasis on having that context-sensitive redevelopment through siting and massing. As we talked a little bit about having those subcategories within districts, on the local roads, you would see low-rise buildings up to 2 or 3 stories, such as single detached duplexes and suites. When you get to the minor roads, that could be low-rise up to 3 stories, such as townhouses, triplex, and fourplexes. And then in those major areas, up to 4 stories, such as small scale apartments with rear surface parking. And our next poll question. Currently, the maximum height for the established neighborhoods is 12 meters, which could mean a house up to 3 stories tall. What should the maximum building height be in the established neighborhoods? The building height should be lowered to 2 stories. The building height should stay the same at 3 stories, or the building height should be varied based on the street type. All right, thank you, everyone. Next, we've got the residential general district. So this is the district that is for those new and developing residential neighborhoods with some supporting commercial uses. And it's equivalent to the residential compact development and residential narrow lot in the existing land use bylaw. So here we'd expect to see residential dwelling units and a little bit of neighborhood commercial as well. And in this district, this is where you'd see a lot of variety in lot sizes and housing forms, from single detached dwellings to small scale apartments. And this is the area where you're going to see more of that narrow and compact development. So on the local roads, envisioning low rise up to 3 stories, so single detached townhouses, duplexes, and suites. On the minor roads, low rise up to 3 stories, from single detached to small scale apartments. And on the major roads, it could be low compact, mid-rise up to 6 stories. So from single detached houses to compact apartment buildings with some opportunities for neighborhood commercial. And then we've got the residential urban district. So this was that area around the urban center, and the purpose is to provide some more dense residential area and with some limited commercial uses. Here we'd expect to see some housing from low rise to compact mid rise. with development on existing low-rise lots could also include some secondary suites, garden suites, or garage suites. And commercial uses would be permitted on the floor of medium or high-rise built forms. So this is equivalent to the mixed-use residential, mixed-use neighborhood, and mixed-use comprehensive districts in the existing bylaw. So in this district, there's no distinction between the local, minor, and major because they're all on the same road type. So here we'd expect to see that housing range from low-rise to mid-rise built forms, so semi-detached to compact mid-rise apartments, the maximum height being 6 stories. And this district has an emphasis on the public realm and pedestrian environment. And next, I'm going to hand it over to Robin to go over the commercial districts.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. So for the mixed use and commercial districts, there are 3 main changes that we've explored in this new draft. So the first being that we've simplified the district categories to only 3. So this includes historic Main Street, general commercial, and mixed use. The historic Main Street recognizes along 50th that historic component towards 48th Street. The second thing that we've done also is that the uses in the land use bylaw, there's quite a number of them. So what we've done is we've worked on consolidating them and simplifying them, especially where there's a lot of similarities, just to make this more simple and easier moving forward. So the bullet points that you see here, for example, eating and drinking establishments, childcare facilities, entertainment uses, these all had quite a number of different uses. So we've kind of categorized these down into those main ones. And then also just touching on parking really quickly. For commercial uses in the existing bylaw, there are numerous different types of rates for different types of uses. And they can vary based on the floor area versus maybe the number of people that might be going to a restaurant or other ways in that. So we're looking at exploring on how to simplify that and bring the number of rates down to make that more predictable and understandable in the future. So going through the districts really quickly, we'll start with the mixed use one. So the intent of the mixed use district is to provide for that mix of commercial and residential uses along major corridors, as well as in the urban center and within some of those local nodes throughout the city of Leduc. So the types of uses that you're primarily going to see here will be a mixed use building structure where you're going to see commercial and retail uses on the ground level, and then upper floors would consist of office and residential uses. You would also see on some sites where there's a mix of different types of buildings that support maybe a singular use. So you might see a couple commercial buildings as well as a couple of residential buildings on the same site. So when we compare this to the existing land use bylaw, the equivalent districts there are the mixed use residential district as well as the mixed use comprehensive one. And then when we look at the context of how these different forms are going to look based on the type of road that it's on. For local roads, we would anticipate low and mid-rise forms up to 6 stories. For minor, we would see it up to 12. And then on major, we would see more mid and high-rise forms up to 26 stories. The second one we have here is the historic Main Street. So the intent of this one is to support that pedestrian vibrancy and commercial activity along 50th Avenue as that main street in Leduc, and really reinforcing that historic character and component that it has. So this will consist of commercial uses activating the ground floor, and then you might see some office and residential uses above. And then to enforce that existing character, the regulations would work to make sure that the development is complementary, that we're maybe preserving and adapting historic buildings, that there's an enhancement to the public realm and the pedestrian experience. And then we're keeping heights low at 4 stories with a second floor step back. So that means that any part of the building above the second floor would be required to be moved away from the property line. And then also, as this is in the urban center and to really enhance that pedestrian experience, there would be no parking requirements in this segment. And then lastly, we have our general commercial district, which is intended to provide those general commercial and employment opportunities, as well as some of those urban amenities that are incorporated throughout. So this district is primarily going to consist of commercial uses, such as businesses, professional services, retail, and other service uses. So for example, this would be like Duke Commons. And then also depending on the context, light industrial uses, vehicle-orientated services, and custom manufacturing may be permitted based on context. And then when it comes to what the built form and the design of these areas are going to look like, they're going to be located in those high exposure areas where residential development is not appropriate. And then there will be some enhancements such as landscaping and pedestrian safety to provide that kind of enhancement throughout parking areas and the sidewalk conditions. And then equivalent land use districts from the existing land use bylaw would be comparable to the general commercial as well as the commercial business orientated district. And then with that, I'm going to pass it on to Josh.
Thanks, Robin. So we're in the home stretch now. I'll take you through to the end of the presentation. There's only a few more slides, a few more districts to go through, and then we can jump into the Q&A. But I'll talk a little bit about industrial districts. So the light industrial districts is really intended to be a fairly kind of diverse district that's got light industrial professional businesses and some select commercial uses within it. We want to encourage the co-location of small office buildings and small scale retails and enable different types of form. This is the equivalencies in the existing land use bylaw are light industrial and business light industrial, and we've kind of integrated those together into one. What I spoke about earlier when I was going through the map was that there is that kind of minor version which limits the congregation of large numbers of the public in special areas to buffer around the special industrial use. So that's that minor designation you're seeing there. So it doesn't change the form at all, but it does change the way buildings can be used a little bit. And then the major designation really supports a really wide variety, a really flexible industrial zone to promote the most economic diversity possible. The medium industrial zone supports larger scale industrial activities, so that's kind of why it's pushed a little more to the north side of the city. Kind of distinction here between light and medium is that in the medium industrial, what we would call nuisance, which includes odor and dust and other things like that, those nuisances can't leave the district boundary, right? So on the light industrial side, we think more about how a lot impacts its neighbors. And in the medium industrial, we think more about how the district impacts its neighbors. So that's kind of a distinction between the two. So light and medium intensity manufacturing, logistics, distribution, things that require kind of larger principal buildings, outdoor storage, kind of yards, those types of things are targeted in this district. Prioritizes safety assessments and heavy duty infrastructure to manage dangerous conditions. So thinking a little bit less about form, thinking about landscaping, but really thinking about kind of safety and life safety and in this area and goods movement. Those are the main considerations in medium industrial. The minor major designation is the same as the light industrial. It's about where those major industrials need to buffer and wrap around the special industrial uses, which is here. And as I mentioned, special industrial is more of that high intensity industrial operations. There are some chemical plants operating. Those types of things are kind of in that special industrial lots, right? And that's kind of taken on a lot by lot basis. So those are areas that are involve handling of dangerous goods. So, and the equivalent in the existing land use bylaw is also special industrial. So throughout the three industrial districts, there aren't kind of significant changes from what's there today. We're just kind of trying to push forward and make some small changes. Urban services, I had talked about that blue zone, which is the kind of regionally significant, kind of the major centers in Leduc for recreation, open space, education, institutions, healthcare, community services, emergency response. So those are kind of captured in there. So those are really the kind of core civic pieces in Leduc. And the equivalent in the existing land use bylaw is partially general recreation and partially urban services. But as I mentioned, community parks themselves are kind of folded into each specific district rather than being called out in this way. There's natural heritage, so that's protect and preserve naturally significant and sensitive areas. So, the edge of Telford Lake, some of the kind of creek, riverine creek landscapes. And the existing land use bylaw has something called environmentally restricted development, and these are very similar, very similar. Residential manufactured we touched on, so that's manufactured home communities, and there's no significant changes to the bylaws there. And the equivalent is also named residential manufactured home. So that's, again, quite similar. And then urban transition. So this is, as I mentioned, the land kind of at the edges, which is designated for development that's within the municipal boundary, but has not been kind of developed quite yet. And the existing equivalent is called urban reserve. So again, it's a very similar idea to what's in the existing land use bylaw. So all of that together kind of brings us to the end of the presentation and the draft districts that as they stand. And what's kind of going on with the project now. Robin touched on this a little bit, but after we go through this round of engagement and start talking to the community and the city and council about some of these ideas that are in this first draft of the land use bylaw, we'll put together a what we heard report that will be publicly available online for folks to see what the themes that emerged out of these conversations were and how they'll impact the next draft of the land use bylaw. We'll be developing a housing catalog, so that will help us think about specifically sensitive infill buildings in the land use bylaw. So, really actually designing buildings that we want to see happen in Leduc, and then those can inform kind of how the regulations enable those kinds of buildings. Again, focused on infill development, so thinking about kind of the established neighborhoods, what new housing might look like in some of these communities. And then after that, we're going to kind of go through a refinement process of the land use bylaw, leading to a second draft. So I will say thank you for listening and participating on behalf of the whole team. And we can start a Q&A session, whether there's some in the chat or hands being raised. And I'll stop sharing so you can see us all again.
Thanks, Josh. There is a question that came through on the chat, so I'll just summarize it for the group and the benefit of the audience. So there was an earlier example referenced for the established residential established areas, including lot coverage of a maximum of 45% and 40% for soft landscaping. Are there plans to review or revisit these percentages, and are they currently outside of the scope of the project? And the reason for the question, I'll just add to it, is that the person asking the question is saying that the residential established areas offer some great opportunities to help address housing and business growth in the community. However, the maximums might be limiting for property owners who are considering modifications. So this might be an opportunity to change that and provide some more flexibility.
Yeah, good question. I can jump in, and if anyone wants to follow me, please feel free. Yes, those are within the scope of the project. That's exactly the kind of thing we need to get right. So those percentages are what's in the first draft, but I think this feedback is helpful for us to think about it. As we go into the second draft, we are going to be revisiting these. I mentioned the housing catalog is going to be an example for us to kind of test fit these lots for different types of buildings and different types of uses. It's something that we'll also be doing as we refine the bylaw, is really starting to test out different combinations of uses. But I agree, the intention, what we really want to bring to this, the intention is that, modifying an existing dwelling to have a home-based building or to add a garden suite or to add a suite within the home is what we actually want to achieve. So we don't want to limit those types of things from happening. We've got kind of competing priorities, and so we're trying to find a good balance between preserving, some soft landscaping space on a residential lot and enabling, a good variety of uses. But we will be getting those numbers right and testing them more and more and more to make sure that 40 and that 45% is the right percent. So I hope that gives some context and an answer. But if there's a follow-up, feel free to drop it in the chat.
Thank you. So there's a second question. Are there any changes regarding using your entire home as a business or as an Airbnb?
Um, an entire home as a business, I would not be enabled. The business would be kind of a secondary use within the house. We haven't kind of tracked into the Airbnb territory quite yet. It's something that we've heard, but it can be typically those things are kind of governed by separate bylaws that the city puts together, not something that's specifically in the land use bylaw, so that city can be kind of more nimble with those kinds of regulations and doesn't have to update an entire bylaw for those types of things. So I would say the Airbnb thing, it's something we're thinking about, but it's probably not specifically in the scope of the first draft land use bylaw that we're working on. And then in terms of using an entire home, yeah, like I said, the business would have to be a part of a home. So there would be residential as kind of the primary use on a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we have a comment now that I'll just read out. So the comment is, hi, I wanted to echo the concern that the 40% soft landscaping requirement appears to be quite high. It's important to allow adequate space for driveways and walkways without significantly impacting the size of the home. In addition, limiting hardscaping in backyards can create accessibility challenges for individuals who require hard surfaces for mobility or other lifestyle needs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just looking, we have a couple more that have come through now. So the next one is my neighbor does not live in his house and rents suites up and down. I guess the question is this considered an appropriate use of the existing home? If it makes it more of a hotel type use or a duplex scenario. So it's a little bit building off of the question around the Airbnb use.
Yeah, I think it's probably a similar answer. Whether the secondary unit needs to be rented out by kind of the primary dweller of the house is something that can be covered in other kind of legislation and other bylaws. It's not something that we're touching now. We're thinking more just about the units within or the number of dwellings within a building, within a home, and not necessarily who lives in those homes. It's not something that we're considering in this first draft of the land use bylaw.
And I think I would add on top of that, when it's legislated for short-term rentals, Airbnbs, it's treated differently than long-term rentals. So if someone was renting the basement and then the upstairs, it's not often that you see a lot of regulation for that in land use bylaws. For short-term rentals, what we've seen in a lot of municipalities is they have a separate short-term rental bylaw, and then you might find a provision or two in the land use bylaw to support that. But usually there's a separate bylaw first.
So there's a process question about the project. So what is the target date to have the land use bylaw finalized?
The end of the year we're targeting, sort of getting it towards the end of the year, yeah, and then there'll be a process of getting, council will ultimately have to adopt the land use bylaw, so that may be a little bit of a process, but we're currently targeting the end of 2026 to have our final draft, or final version, I should say.
Our next question is about the minimum building widths. So do we have an idea of the minimum building widths for townhouses that will be presented in the draft land use bylaw?
Yeah, so in the draft land use bylaw, It's going to be dependent on the district that it's in. So in the residential general district, which is for the newer neighborhoods, townhouses are currently at the minimum is 4.9 meters, and with some discretion for the development authority to go down to 4.2 meters at a minimum, and with some regulations on how many of those you can have per block.
And also at 4.9 meters is about 16 feet, I think, right? Just for, yeah.
Yeah, and the 4.2 would be the 14 feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, our next question is about commercial areas. So it is, does the new bylaw address the number of similar businesses in close proximity, for example, liquor stores or childcare?
Yeah, so there are some separation requirements for particular uses such as cannabis, retail, and liquor stores. Cannabis, they cannot be within 200 meters of one another. And then with liquor, it's 100 meters of if it's within like a park or a school, or more of those kind of sensitive land uses. And then when it comes to childcare uses, there are a list of different requirements that that childcare facility must meet. So there's not necessarily a separation requirement between another daycare to another daycare, but that lot that it's on would have to be able to accommodate the conditions required to support it.
What I might also add to that is that specifically on the childcare piece, one of the things that the existing land use bylaw does is it quite limits the geography that a daycare or a childcare facility can exist within, and so it really pushes them all into the urban center, into the downtown area. And so what the kind of draft land use bylaw we're talking about is trying to do is to open it up a little bit and to bring the capacity for other parts of Leduc to have childcare facilities. And what we anticipate is that would reduce the pressure on the urban center to have all of the childcare facilities and allow them to spread out a little bit. And as Robin said, there's kind of specific regulations about the right conditions for a childcare facility. But part of the reason that you're seeing maybe less relevant to the liquor stores, but certainly to the childcare, part of the reason that there is a concentration of them is that there's a kind of a limited number of places that they can actually exist. So they kind of cluster because of that.
Okay, so the next question we have is asking about when the bylaw draft is finalized. How long does it typically take council to approve them? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Approximate timelines, considering that there's probably a lot of different variables involved.
Is this something that maybe we can ask the city folks if they have any specific guidance on that kind of timeline? Or I don't know if Eleanor or Lindsay want to have an answer, but
Yeah,
Well,
thanks for the. Oh.
Sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So there's definitely lots of variables involved, but the idea is to bring it forward to council. And then our process is there is that first reading, there's the public hearing, and then second and third reading. So like we can plan and schedule, but it ultimately is up to council to end the public hearing to hear feedback from the public before adopting a bylaw. So there's things that we can control and then also things that's up to council.
Okay, so our next question is around flooding issues and sinkholes. So how are these being addressed? So for example, existing sinkholes in apartment parking lots. So it sounds like a maintenance question, and how are property managers who are out of province held accountable? So also maybe a bylaw question. bylaw. So maybe that's also a Jessica question to answer.
I can quickly maybe start on the first one, the flooding issues and sinkholes. I think, yeah, to Jessica or to sorry, Chelsea, to Chelsea's point, I think it's not something that the land use bylaw is specifically dealing with. We do know we're environmentally sensitive areas. There is some kind of flooding data available, so we know where kind of there's risk for certain kinds of flooding and can, change the land use to discourage certain types of development from happening in certain areas that might be prone to flooding. It doesn't address the kind of sinkhole question, but I think that's probably the closest the land use bylaw gets to answering that question, which is kind of assessing the risk of kind of natural hazards and trying to make sure the right land uses and the right types of buildings or no buildings exist in those areas. But the sinkhole would probably be a maintenance issue, and the out of province may be outside the scope of the land use bylaw.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'll just add on that, like, if anything maintenance-wise on private property would be dealt by the private landowner or property manager on that site. So typically the city may not be involved in situations like that.
Thank you. Our next question is around residential mixed use and if there is provision for multi-unit senior housing, like duplexes, apartment condos, etc.
Yes, there are. I think what we've been talking about is that we're trying to regulate the shape of the building, but not necessarily how the building is used quite as much. So I think we're trying to enable things like seniors housing in more parts of the city. If they're in that scale of a duplex or a triplex, then certainly that works. The larger buildings, the larger kind of seniors housing facilities will kind of have to go into the neighborhoods where we've got, or sorry, the areas where we've got space for larger buildings. But yeah, certainly at that duplex, triplex phase, size and shape, like I said, we're trying to actually encourage those kinds of buildings, and trying to control a little bit less how, who the residents are, I suppose. So I think we do.
I'm going to jump over to a question that was submitted and kind of summarizing for theme. And so this is around visitor parking. So the question is, how will the land use bylaw ensure adequate and practical visitor parking to support livability? So in particular, related to multi-unit housing and housing that backs onto laneways.
Sure. So the resident or visitor parking, so we do have minimum visitor parking in all the districts. Like we had kind of talked about, we have been exploring some reductions in certain parts of the city, like the urban center. But for multi-unit buildings, there would be more of an apartment style building. There would be visitor parking requirements. If there's a home-based business, there may be parking requirements for, depending on the type of business, for customers going there. So in residential districts, there are requirements for visitor parking for the larger building types, kind of above the fourplex size. So it is considered through minimum rates that would be applied to lots.
And then a second part is around safety and security, kind of the same context, rear lanes, and how septet considerations might be addressed the land use bylaw. So SEPTED being crime prevention through environmental design. So just general safety considerations.
Yeah, switching to a more form-based code, we have a lot more design regulations included within the bylaw. So there are a lot more things that will encourage things regarding septed, so things like more lighting. So you'll see more design regulations within this bylaw to sort of address that.
I'm just typing back to the question about how long previous councils have taken to get bylaws approved, and we can get back to you on that, maybe with a rough idea of in the past how that's worked. And then we have another question looking at the current housing regulations. It is specific to a specific neighborhood, so I will summarize and interpret the question around the proximity of houses being built to each other within new neighborhoods. Is the current land use bylaw um, going to be updated to address this?
So the draft land use bylaw is looking at the development that's already happening in Leduc, and it's looking at incorporating that to enable that to continue as well. So I'm not sure if there was a specific area that we thought maybe you thought maybe houses were too close to each other or too far away, but it is looking at trying to enable continuing the same type of development that's already occurring.
Yeah, I saw sort of a question in there about a couple areas that may have been called out, but I think that it is true that there are some of the newer developing communities that have some more, I would say, housing diversity. There's some townhouses, there's some stacked townhouses, there's some single detached, there's some narrower houses, some wider houses. So those kind of new neighborhood forms, I think, as Lindsay mentioned, the intention in those new neighborhoods is to allow those diversity of housing types to continue. And to encourage that, these neighborhoods continue to be mixed, and maybe not so specific, this corner is specifically for narrow lots in this area here. But again, as we talk tying it maybe a little bit more towards the kinds of streets and the kinds of, walking environments that a neighborhood has. So it may be more tied to kind of a street than a specific kind of corner of a site has these ones and has these ones. Yeah, but enabling all of those types.
I just want to go back and answer that timeline question about maybe when the approval of the plan might happen. So right now we're looking at early 2027 for that to happen. Quite a bit of a process to go through until we get to that point. But in terms of a general idea of timing, that would be it, early 2027.
Thanks, Eleanor. How about tiny homes? Are we permitting tiny homes with the new land use bylaw?
Yeah, this is something we've been talking about internally, actually, was tiny homes. There's nowhere in the land use bylaw that they're specifically called out as being permitted at the moment. I think that's another detail that we'll keep diving into to see if there is, the right context for things like tiny homes to exist. Currently, they're not specifically called out as permitted in kind of just a general sense, I would say, the average lot. But again, in my head, I'm thinking about tiny homes as kind of a very specific concept, rather than, a small house, a small home. So in the context of kind of capital T, capital H tiny homes, I think that they're kind of not broadly enabled in the land use bylaw at this point. But again, we've been talking about it and we are trying to figure out the right approach there. There may be the right context for them in Leduc.
The next question is, Are there provisions to change zoning in existing neighborhoods where there are no current commercial sites? So for example, windrows.
So within the established neighborhood, residential neighborhood district, it does allow for some commercial uses along those more major roads. So you could see some integration of some commercial sites over time on those larger streets, but it would still have to fit in with that neighborhood character kind of quality and design regulations in that district as well.
Don't see any other questions, and we have about 10 minutes remaining. And we just have a message saying thank you for the opportunity to participate, and we appreciate all of your questions, and thank you for participating as well.
Thanks, everyone. That was really great. Okay, I guess before we say people are starting to drop off, I guess we should just mention that we have a couple in-person public engagement events coming up and an online survey. So maybe we can pull up the details. This Saturday, there's a public event happening, and then as well Tuesday evening. I don't know if we can share the link to the survey maybe in the chat, or the survey will be made live, and then there's another opportunity for people to provide feedback through the survey before the process is over. So we're still in this feedback process for another couple of weeks before we start getting back into the work. So lots of opportunities to hear from you. If things come to you in the middle of the night tonight or in the coming days, please do come see us in person or drop us a line through the survey. All right, thanks everyone. I think we're good to break it up. Have a good night. Thanks for taking time out to be here.